For many people, the Eiffel Tower is the first image that comes to mind when they think of Paris, France. It dominates the city's skyline, it draws visitors from around the world, and it is instantly recognizable to people near and far. The Eiffel Tower is an enduring symbol of France. It became a great symbol of its age because the general public recognized in their new forms a technological world of surprise and appeal. In this video I will show how that tower is only one of the numberless works of recent engineering that constitute a new art form, which is parallel 1L2 and fully independent of architecture. The Eiffel Tower was built to serve as the grand centerpiece of the Exposition Universelle, a World's Fair held in Paris in 1889. It was intended as a symbol of the fair's main themes, the celebration of France's cultural achievements and the dramatic advances in science and technology then taking place. But it had another ambitious purpose, boosting French patriotism and pride that was suffering after years of political upheaval. When Eiffel's proposal was put before the fair's organizers, nothing even remotely like it had ever been built. The man behind this daring proposal was already one of France's preeminent engineers when he submitted his plan to the organizers of the World's Fair. His reputation had been built on designing and building large iron structures in innovative ways. Even though the tower would bear his name, Eiffel had little to do with the details of its design. That task fell to 3 senior members of his company, who did the actual design work and the calculations that would make the tower's construction possible. Nonetheless, Eiffel was always the linchpin of the project. He oversaw the initial designs for the giant structure. His flair for presentation and marketing his projects ensured that he won the competition to build the fair's signature structure. The roots of the 1889 Exposition Universelle in Paris can be traced to a cataclysmic event that took place exactly 100 years earlier. This event, the French Revolution, was one of the most important episodes in the history of France. For many centuries French kings and queens had ruled with absolute authority. Supporting them was a complex system of dukes, barons, and other aristocrats, all members of the ruling class. These royal figures enjoyed great wealth and essentially complete power over the lives of common people through practices such as heavy taxation and a lack of civil rights. But the French people grew increasingly resentful of aristocratic rule, and in 1789 this discontent reached the boiling point. A rebellion took shape. This uprising, the French Revolution, was marked by a decade of extreme violence, most notably against the royals and aristocrats and anyone else who opposed the new order. The most famous of these unfortunate victims were King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette. In the wake of the monarchy and its aristocratic regime came a new form of government, the First Republic, based on the then radical concepts, liberty, equality, and fraternity. As 1889 approached, the French government wanted to do something special to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. Authorities also wanted a way to defuse the tense political climate that had been building in France since the 1870s. That turmoil stemmed primarily from the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, which pitted France against the Kingdom of Prussia. This conflict, rooted in years of animosity between the two nations, led to widespread food shortages and a brutal bombardment of Paris. The war ended in victory for Prussia and, as part of the spoils of war, the winning nation was able to form a government in France that was sympathetic to its own royal leader, Emperor Wilhelm I. The dominance of monarchist Prussia over France naturally outraged those French citizens committed to maintaining their nation as free and democratic. A group of French radicals in the capital city formed a rebel alliance called the Paris Commune. The Commune's armed members managed to briefly take over and occupy Paris from mid-March until late May 1871. When French soldiers loyal to the Prussian-controlled government defeated them in bloody battle. However, the dramatic standoff between the communards and the government did not resolve itself in the 1870s or 1880s. The tense situation was made worse by dissension among various factions on both sides, coupled with a serious economic depression. By the early 1880s, the Third Republic, as the current French government was known, was in serious danger of collapse. In 1884, as a way of easing the political tension, French Prime Minister Jules Ferry proposed a major World's Fair. It would take place in 1889, on the anniversary of the Revolution, specifically the anniversary of the storming of the notorious Bastille prison, which had been destroyed in the revolutionary uprising and, a century later, was still the most potent symbol of rebellion. Ferry's hope was that the opposing sides could suspend their differences for the duration of the exposition, creating an atmosphere of peace and healing the rifts between factions by bringing them together in a common cause. It was also hoped that the construction and operation of the fair would be a boost to the nation's flagging economy. Not least among its purposes, meanwhile, was to raise the morale of the French by demonstrating to the world that their nation was still a major figure in global culture, politics, and science and technology. In this way, the planned fair was in large part designed to raise the prestige of the French nation among the other nations of the world. From the outset, the fair was a great success. More than 32 million visitors from all over the world. Some nations boycotted the exposition, not wanting to be associated with an event that commemorated the French Revolution. Notably, the German government chose not to participate because of continued ill feelings dating from the days of the Franco-Prussian War and its aftermath. However, the German government did allow some German manufacturers to display their products to take advantage of the commercial benefits of worldwide exposure. These displays of culture and science were impressive on their own. But one aspect of the exposition was, by far, the most dazzling of them all. This was the gargantuan Eiffel Tower, which served as the main entrance to the fairgrounds. The concept of a giant tower had been part of the central planning of the exposition since the fair's earliest stages. The event's organizers, eager to create an extraordinary symbol of the exposition's theme, had in 1884 announced an open competition for its construction, which was specified to reach a proposed height of 984 feet. The competition received more than 100 designs, some of which were outlandish or would be clearly impossible to build. A commission assembled by the fair's organizers was given the responsibility of examining the various proposals, and by June 1886 announced that every plan but one was either impractical, insufficiently worked out, or simply bizarre. A winner was then announced, Gustave Eiffel, who proposed a tower in the shape of a giant pylon, composed of 4 legs that tapered to the top, forming a kind of elongated pyramid. At this time, Eiffel was France's leading structural engineer and a well-known, highly respected figure. Eiffel had been born in Dijon, in east-central France, in 1832. He had shown a knack for the basics of engineering at a young age, excelling in his understanding of mathematics, physics, and science. He He also inherited a flair for successfully operating a business. Perhaps he inherited some of his business sense from his mother, Catherine, who expanded the family business into a large coal distribution operation. It proved so successful that her husband, Alexander, gave up his job as an administrator for the French army in order to assist her. Eiffel graduated from Dijon's Lycée Royal with degrees in humanities and science. He went on to attend several colleges before graduating in 1855, an engineering university in Paris. Eiffel graduated from this school near the top of his class. By all accounts, this high ranking was due as much to his perseverance and work ethic as to his brilliance as a student. Eiffel's knowledge during this period in designing and building railway bridges set him on his future path. He rose quickly through the ranks and became the railway company's chief engineer. Eiffel relished every aspect of the work, from the mathematics and physics needed to imagine and design a project to solving the technical problems of construction. And he liked to be present during the construction phase, regularly visiting the job sites, where he could work directly with the construction supervisors and workers. Eager to make a name for himself, Eiffel decided to strike off on his own in 1868. He partnered with another engineer, Théophile Seyrig, to form the firm Eiffel and Company, which specialized in the design and construction of large-scale iron bridges and buildings. The biggest and most famous projects that Eiffel took on during this period involved one of the world's most familiar and beloved icons, the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, a gift from France to the United States. This powerful symbol of freedom had an exterior of thin but enormously heavy copper sheets. This facade needed a strong framework to support it, and the statue's designer, sculptor Frederick Bartholdi, specifically chose Eiffel to create this interior framework. In fact, building the statue would have been impossible without Eiffel's contributions. Eiffel's deep knowledge of how large metal structures could be successfully built proved to be vital to the project. After Eiffel won the competition to design and build the Expositions Tower, he spent many months negotiating the details with Paris city officials. The negotiations were a lengthy and often frustrating process, in part because so many governmental organizations had to give the project their approval. The process dragged on so long that Eiffel almost abandoned the project. At one point he noted in a letter to the fair authorities, "I would be very sorry to renounce the construction of what most agree will be one of the exposition's principal attractions." Eventually the two sides came to an agreement, and a contract was signed in January 1887. The project's budget was set at 8 million francs. The Parisian government granted Eiffel 1.5 million francs toward his construction costs, which was less than a quarter of the estimated total. Eiffel offered to cover a substantial amount of the remaining cost and raise the rest from investors. In return, Parisian authorities agreed to give him the profits from admission sales for 20 years, the amount of time the tower was scheduled to remain standing. Although Eiffel usually receives full credit for the tower that bears his name, in fact he was not responsible for its basic concept. Two of Eiffel's senior engineers, Maurice Coechlin and Émile Nougier, had begun work on the Barcelona proposal some 5 years before the Parisian tower was built. Coechlin's preliminary drawings envisioned a giant structure 984 feet tall. In most respects the early plans he and Nougier developed were essentially the same as what was finally built. The shape Coechlin proposed thus looked something like an elongated pyramid. Its four gently curving girders, the vertical legs, would be held up with trusses, frameworks that strengthen and support the girders, placed at regular intervals. The legs would support 3 platforms above street level. 2 of these levels were to be public viewing platforms. The first level would be 187 feet from the ground and roughly 45,200 square feet in area. This left plenty of space for such amenities as a restaurant, a bar, a 250-seat theater, and a viewing promenade 8.5 feet wide that would provide visitors with a spectacular view. The second level would be 377.2 feet high and have an area of some 15,000 square feet with room for more restaurants and viewing spots. The third level was not originally planned to be open to the public, although many years later a small observation deck was added to it, and it was available to the public. This third level was to be 905.5 feet off the ground and would house a small apartment and workshop for Eiffel. In time, after it was completed, the apartment was lavishly decorated with such elegant touches as oil paintings, a piano, and velvet-fringed couches. Eiffel liked many aspects of Coquelin and Nougier's concept as it was revamped for the Parisian contest. For example, he liked the idea of adding 2 levels that would include restaurants and other attractions. But he was not satisfied with the concept for the overall look of the tower. The original plan was stark and unadorned, little more than a dull assemblage of girders. It would have appeared a little like the sort of tower that today is used for supporting electrical cables across long distances. Eiffel saw the design as practical, but it did not impress him as beautiful or pleasing to the eye. So Eiffel commissioned a respected Parisian architect, Stephen Sauvestre, to join the team and make improvements. Sauvestre's contributions included horizontal, curved grillwork arches, more artistically pleasing pedestals, a bulb-shaped design for the top, and various improvements to the public viewing areas and restaurants, such as a glass pavilion on the first level. All of Sauvestre's additions were purely decorative, not structural, that is, they were not necessary to the tower's strength or safety. However, they did make the tower more beautiful, and, perhaps just as important, they also made it appear sturdier. This, Eiffel knew, would be a key element in reassuring the expositions committee and, later, the public about its safety. Designing the tower was only part of the process. Another important element was to settle on the type of material that Eiffel would use to build it. He considered steel but ultimately rejected it. Steel was a new and relatively untested material, and Eiffel lacked confidence in how it might perform. Instead, he decided to stay with what he knew best, iron. Eiffel decided on a type of iron called puddle iron, so named because of the process used to make it. This process was in common use at the time and was well tested and reliable. It involves melting the iron into a liquid state, then swirling it to remove carbon and other impurities in the metal from the final product. The molten iron is then puddled into molds that help shape the iron into its final form. Eiffel's decision to use iron instead of steel proved to be a turning point in the history of construction. Only a few years after the tower was built, the manufacture of steel was perfected. Steel soon became the preferred material for large building construction. So, the most famous structure built in the 19th century, one that was meant to symbolize cutting-edge technology, was made of a material that was about to be superseded by something better. Eiffel's comments about the technical challenges re-elect his realistic view of the project. Nothing like this tower had ever been built before on such a grand scale, and the project's countless problems required equally countless innovative solutions. Some were small, some huge, and, of course, all of them had to be resolved many decades before computers could help calculate and catalog the vast amount of data that was required to solve problems and store information. One prominent example of the problems Eiffel faced was the absolute necessity of maintaining accuracy where each separate piece of the tower met. The design and manufacture of each of these parts had to be precise. For example, a tiny mistake in calculation could have thrown off the angle of a leg's incline as it was built. Even a small deviation in this angle would have affected the stability of the tower, forcing Eiffel to pull the entire structure down before rebuilding. Every pair of rivet holes had to be designed to match up with such precise accuracy that they would not be more than 0.04 inches, 1 millimeter, apart when it was time for them to be joined together. Severe weather conditions, always a concern on large construction projects, presented additional challenges for Eiffel's team because of the tower's great height. Eiffel had years of experience in building and bridge construction, so he understood how strong winds could damage a badly designed structure. The plan for the tower had Eiffel's complete confidence. He felt certain it would fulfill his goals of beauty and sturdiness. To avoid wind damage, Eiffel and his engineers had designed the tower as a latticed, open-air structure with minimal obstacles, so that even the strongest gusts could pass right through it. Their calculations of wind resistance were so accurate that the tower swayed only a negligible amount in even the strongest wind. Wind was not the only climatic challenge. Eiffel's design also had to take into account heat and cold. Once again, Eiffel's construction experience had prepared him for the challenge. Eiffel knew that on hot days the iron tower would slightly expand and cold temperatures would cause the tower to slightly contract. Knowing this, Eiffel's team designed the tower to withstand even the most extreme weather. The team calculated the amount of expansion so precisely that even in the hottest weather the tip of the tower moves no more than about 6 inches. A related challenge concerned protecting the tower's exposed iron from rain and snow. Unlike steel, which was yet to be perfected as a material for construction, iron rusts unless treated with a strong coat of paint. This required a system of scaffolding that would allow workers to reach all of the tower's exposed areas, which in this case meant the entire structure, for repainting jobs. The process of repainting the tower, which has to be done approximately every 7 years, is dangerous but necessary. Eiffel notes, "We will most likely never realize the full importance of painting the tower, that it is the essential element in the conservation of metal works, and the more meticulous the paint job, the longer the tower shall endure." Still another design challenge concerned the elevators. Eiffel felt that a standard elevator traveling up and down through the structure's center would ruin the simple, open look of the tower. Instead, he insisted that the elevators be designed so that they could ascend and descend along the gentle curves of the tower's legs. Once the elevator location was decided, the challenge was to design elevators that could accommodate the expected crowds. Along with the one spiral staircase, the elevators needed to accommodate a large number of visitors from 2,000 to 2,500 people every hour. Perfecting the elevators was the single most difficult challenge in designing and building the structure. This was because, at the time, no elevator was capable of moving safely up and down a structure as high as the Eiffel Tower. So, a single elevator could take visitors from the ground level, where they entered the structure, to the first level, which included a promenade, public viewing areas, a theater, and restaurants. But that same elevator did not have enough power to reach the second level, which offered additional public viewing areas and restaurants. The solution came from Leonidas, a prominent French inventor, and one of Eiffel's former classmates in engineering school. Leonidas devised an ingenious plan. Leonidas's design involved two connected elevators in each of the tower's 4 legs. In each leg, one elevator rose from the ground to the first level, and another elevator took visitors from the first level to the second level. Each elevator car in a set weighed some 10 tons and could carry up to 65 passengers at a time. The cars would not have separate counterbalances to raise and lower them, as was usual for elevators at the time. Instead, Leonidas's elevators were joined together by ropes so they counterbalanced each other. This arrangement was clever, but somewhat inconvenient for passengers. They could not go all the way up in one car. Instead, they would have to walk from one elevator to the other at the first floor along a narrow gangway. This gangway offered a virtually unobstructed view of Paris, but even with sturdy safety rails, the experience was not for the faint-hearted. All of this preparatory work required staggering amounts of handmade drawings and calculations. 40 or so designers and calculators, the people who did the necessary math, were assigned to the project. In fact, more time was needed to design the tower, roughly 2 years, than it took to build it. During this period of intense work, Eiffel's design office created some 1,700 general drawings for the skeleton alone, not counting the public viewing platforms and other areas. Once this painstaking design process was complete, Eiffel and his colleagues embarked on the next stage, making their bold design a reality. The forging of the iron pieces that would form virtually every part of the tower took place at Eiffel's factory in the Parisian suburb of Levallois-Perret. As was generally true for the project as a whole, the construction of the tower moved at a swift but organized pace. Eiffel's knack for detail and preparation made the short time frame of the construction, just over 2 years, manageable. For the 150 or so employees in the Levallois-Perret factory, the bulk of the work consisted of precisely casting each of the thousands of iron pieces and drilling the holes for the rivets that would hold them together. Most of these individual pieces of iron were then bolted together at the factory into segments of various sizes that could be transported more easily for final assembly at the building site. Each of these individual sections was held together with temporary bolts that were strong enough to keep them together for the journey to the Champ de Mars, but the bolts were by no means strong enough for use in the permanent structure. More permanent rivets would replace them during the building process. As each of the sections was completed at Eiffel's factory, horse-drawn wooden wagons carried them from there to the Champ de Mars site, a distance of some 3 miles. A formal groundbreaking ceremony was held on January 23, 1887, and the preliminary work began. This involved digging out tons of dirt to sink the 4 gigantic concrete and stone foundations that would support the tower's legs. Each of the foundations was sunk to a depth of about 53 feet. These foundations rested on top of thick beds of gravel. Unlike compacted dirt, the gravel beds were slightly flexible, which would allow the tower's legs to be adjusted slightly and to later withstand tiny changes as they heated and cooled with the weather. The work of sinking and stabilizing the east and south foundations was relatively straightforward. The job required digging a trench, building wooden walls to keep it from collapsing, laying the gravel, and pouring the concrete. However, the west and north segments required much more complex engineering and construction than the first two. The extra care in the west and north corners was necessary because these legs were situated closer to the Seine River, where the ground was less solid. Additional support was needed to secure the two foundations that were closest to the river. They required extra reinforcements driven deep into the riverbed to keep their foundation slabs from sliding or sinking in the softer ground. Then, once these reinforcements were built and all four of the tower's concrete foundations were complete, Eiffel's workers moved on to the next phase. They installed limestone blocks on top of each of the foundations. The top surfaces of these limestone blocks were shaped so that they formed shoes into which the feet of the tower's legs would later fit, held in place by gigantic bolts. By late June 1887, about 5 months into the project's on-site phase, the foundation work was complete. Now work on the tower itself could begin. All of the sections from the factory were on site and ready to go, as were a surprisingly small number of workers, considering the scale of the project and its tight deadline. Only 150 to 300 laborers were on site at any given moment, all wearing the traditional blue work clothes and heavy wooden clogs of French construction workers. For these laborers, assembling the huge iron pieces was like putting together a gargantuan, three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. Each section had already been carefully marked, catalogued, and tracked so that it could be identified and properly placed. The factory measurements and other work had been so precise that the iron workers did not need to drill new holes or reshape pieces on site. If, on occasion, they encountered a misshapen piece, it was sent back to the factory and replaced or reconfigured. As the legs of the tower began to rise, the height and angle of each was adjusted slightly. Because of the huge size of the legs, a great deal of power was needed to make even the tiniest of these adjustments. Eiffel's crew used machines that resembled giant jackhammers to provide this power. Meanwhile, sand-filled weights kept the legs in place while they were being shifted and adjusted. Henry Loiret comments, "This perfect organization, which won Eiffel universal praise, gave all observers the impression that the tower was constructing itself. It was a smooth, well-oiled operation where human participation seemed limited, almost non-existent. To build the lower part of the tower, the workers stood on the girders that formed the legs. They hauled up tools and building materials with the help of cranes. But the cranes could only go as high as the first level. Cranes that could go higher did not yet exist. So Eiffel and his team invented steam-powered cranes they called creepers that ran along tracks on the insides of each tower leg. At this point in the construction, the legs leaned inward at a steep angle of 54 degrees and were being kept from falling over only by the huge bolts that had been sunk into the foundation. Building the tower higher without further support would have led to collapse and disaster. So Eiffel arranged for gigantic, progressively higher wooden scaffolds to be built around the legs. These scaffolds were strong enough to support the legs during construction, in addition to supporting all of the necessary equipment and workers. Reaching just the first level of the tower required 16 of these scaffolds, 12 smaller ones, each about 90.5 feet high, and 4 larger ones, each about 131 feet high. Much of the construction relied on the skilled iron workers who attached each piece to its mates. After a girder section had been brought up, the workers removed the temporary bolts that had been holding the pieces together, put the pieces into place, and replaced the temporary bolts with permanent iron rivets. 20 teams of 4 men each performed this grueling work. One heated the rivet over a portable furnace. The heat made it malleable and ready to be hammered into the exact shape needed. Another held the rivet in place as it was slotted into its spot. A third shaped the ends of the rivet into their correct forms while they were still hot. And a fourth beat the rivet with a sledgehammer, pounding it permanently into place. Each rivet was deliberately made a little too long, so that as it cooled from its superheated condition its length contracted slightly and assured a tight fit. Not surprisingly, huge crowds of Parisians and others watched the construction work with fascination, marveling as it grew higher and higher. The riveting work and other jobs were difficult and dangerous and required long hours of heavy labor. A typical workday lasted 12 hours in summer, 10 to 11 hours in autumn and spring, and 9 hours in winter. Toward the end of the construction period, as the deadline drew near, workers were putting in 13-hour days. In addition to putting up with these long days, workers frequently had to endure strong winds, freezing cold, or summertime heat. When the project had started in January 1887, Parisians were ice skating on lakes in the city's parks. The summertime was especially hot during the construction period, with numerous threatening thunderstorms. Eiffel paid his employees well for this hard work. As with any large-scale construction project, many hazards existed at the tower site. The risk of falling from the tower's great height was ever present. A single slip of the foot could be disastrous. Eiffel was always extremely concerned with the safety of his workers. The many precautions he took included building guardrails and screens to stop falls. These safety measures were so thorough that only 2 men died during the project. The construction work continued to move quickly, except for a few details. By the end of March 1888, the tower was finished up to the first level. Less than 3 months later, in June 1888, the basic structure as far as the second level was complete. The tower was now 420 feet above the ground and already closing in on what was then the world's highest structure, the 555-foot Washington Monument. As the deadline drew near, the construction workers stepped up their pace. March 31, 1889, marked the completion of the main structure. However, the finishing touches required a great deal more work. One of the most important of these final tasks involved the elevators. Because nothing like them had been built before, getting the elevators in working order proved to be a major challenge. 2 companies had been hired to build them. Teams from both firms worked feverishly to find solutions to nagging problems that prevented the elevators from working properly. Despite the incomplete work on the elevators, Eiffel decided the time had come to celebrate the tower's completion. On April 1, 1889, he hosted the first of several celebratory gatherings. This included a huge party with champagne and a picnic for all the workers and their families, and another party for the engineers and designers. Eiffel also led a parade of government officials and members of the press to the top of the tower. Because the elevators were not yet functional, the group had to climb the stairs. The ascent to the first level alone took over an hour thanks to the frequent stops Eiffel made along the way to proudly point out various features of his masterpiece. That afternoon Eiffel further celebrated his triumph by personally raising an enormous flag, a tricolore, the national flag of France, at the top of the tower. As the flag fluttered in the wind, a 25-gun salute boomed from the first level to publicly proclaim the tower's completion. Eiffel and his team had a right to be ecstatic. They had achieved something that had never been done before and that many people had regarded as impossible. Furthermore, Eiffel had done it in an astonishingly short time, under budget, and with a few serious accidents. This tower was Monsieur Eiffel's magnum opus, and is a symbol of strength and difficulties overcome. The tower's formal completion at the end of March 1889 was hailed as a major milestone. Although finishing touches were still being made, the fair organizers were delighted with the project. The centerpiece of the exposition, the Iron Tower, was in place, and to the organizers it represented the great promise for the future that they had anticipated. Everyday Parisians had for 2 years watched with anticipation the rise of the intriguing tower that now dominated the skyline of their city. Some shared Eiffel's enthusiasm for the project, but others saw it as an insult to the beauty of Paris's architecture, a useless, ugly waste of money. Both before and during construction, a sizable and vocal segment of the French population had objected to Eiffel's vision. The barrage of criticism from some quarters notwithstanding, much of the public eagerly awaited the official opening of the tower on the day the Grand Fair also opened, May 6, 1889. Although the elevators were still bulky and visitors were obliged to ascend and descend via the staircases for the first few days, public enthusiasm and curiosity remained high. In fact, the prospect of ascending to the top of the structure remained, for many, the most alluring aspect of the fair. The tower was one of the most photographed buildings in Paris, if not the world, even before its much marveled elevators first took visitors to the summit. Those who made the trek to the top, especially before the elevators began working, developed a greater appreciation for the tower's awe-inspiring height. Because the staircases were so narrow, traffic could only go one way. This meant that visitors could not change their minds once they had begun the climb to the top. Despite these and other problems, a proud Eiffel was the first to sign the visitor guest book. On the first day he also hosted a party for family and friends at one of the restaurants on the first level. He spent the rest of that day watching all of the commotion taking place around and on the tower. Eiffel was understandably delighted to see the huge crowds that waited in line to experience ascending his tower, and by extension to take part in an event that was thrillingly new, huge, and modern. Even after the excitement of the opening days subsided, the tower proved to be a roaring success. Every day, long lines of tourists waited patiently to buy tickets. Prices varied, depending on which level a visitor wanted to get to, but they were generally affordable, and tickets were half price on Sundays. The cheapest tickets were for those who chose to climb the stairs, not ride the elevators. In all, 2 million people ventured up the tower during the fair, from May 6 to October 31, 1889, and the lines did not abate even after the exposition closed. Eiffel's faith in his structure's popularity was clearly justified. A few weeks after the tower opened to the public, a number of newspapers around the world reported that Paris was ecstatic about the Eiffel Tower. After waiting patiently in line for tickets, sightseers experienced a thrilling adventure, beginning with the elevator ride. Taking the elevator to the top floor put a visitor 187 feet off the ground. Few people at the time had ever been this high up. The ride up proved to be remarkably smooth, and the public's enthusiasm for the elevators seemed to be barely affected by the fact that their mechanisms were deafeningly noisy. Whether they rose in the elevators or climbed the stairs, visitors had astonishing views through the open girders, culminating in the expansive panorama at the top. Adding to the experience was the thrilling, stomach-clenching illusion that a person could fall from a dizzying height at any moment. Although perception of this danger was all too real for some people, Eiffel's long-standing concern for safety made the possibility of an accident highly unlikely. He had carefully installed such features as handrails, guardrails, and a series of nets to make sure visitors remained safe. Overall, the public areas of the tower had a bustling, lively atmosphere. One visitor noted that visiting the tower was like visiting a city that was hanging in the rigging of an immense ship. In almost every sense, the structure was a success. It was a huge technological, artistic, and financial success. And fears about its safety proved groundless. The triumph was a particular victory for Eiffel, of course. He had remained true to his vision, organized an enormous team to make his vision a reality, and completed the project in record time. Despite facing seemingly impossible odds, Eiffel was enjoying a level of success that comes to few people. The Exposition Universelle had proved to be a spectacular accomplishment. But the World's Fair was also a relatively short-lived event, and its gates closed on October 31, 1889, less than 6 months after they had opened. To mark this occasion, a fireworks display from atop the tower lit up the Parisian night sky. Eiffel had the good fortune to stage this last show against an appropriately dramatic background, a brilliantly clear night with a full moon. It was a good omen for a structure that was slated to come down in only 20 years. According to Eiffel's original contract with the city of Paris, his tower would stay up for only 20 years. After that, in 1909, the tower was scheduled to be dismantled, and the city of Paris would sell the metal as scrap. But that did not happen. Tourists continued to visit the Eiffel Tower long after the fair had closed, and within a year after the tower opened to the public, its builder had recouped his construction costs. Already well off, Eiffel was well on his way to becoming even wealthier. And fortunately for the tower's admirers, the plan to dismantle the structure was never carried out. The tower's usefulness as a radio transmitter, especially during World War I, ensured that it would continue to stay up. With millions of visitors every year, the Eiffel Tower today remains one of the most visited and admired structures in the world. Over the years, the tower has not lost its appeal. An estimated more than 200 million people have visited the tower since it opened. As was true in Eiffel's time, tourists can use the stairs or take the elevator, and, as in the past, ticket prices are lower for those who use the stairs. Both the elevators and stairs lead to the first and second levels, but the elevator is the only way to access the third level, parts of which are open to the public. Those who choose to make the trip on foot can judge the distance they have traveled by noting the regular signs that count off the number of steps. This number has varied slightly over the years, due to various renovations. Today, Getting to the public areas on foot means climbing 1,665 steps, including the few steps that take visitors from the ground to the ticket booths at the base of the tower, as well as those leading from the third-level landing to an upper observation platform. A popular option is to take the elevator up and climb down. Whether ascending in the elevators or on foot, visitors can do much more than simply enjoy the thrilling panorama of Paris. A small museum and other displays on all of the viewing levels provide glimpses into the tower's history. Also, Eiffel's private apartment and lab on the top platform have been restored to their original condition, with wax figures standing in for Eiffel and Edison. Not surprisingly, the Eiffel Tower requires constant maintenance for these and other parts of the structure. For this task, the city of Paris, which still owns the tower, created a public utility and maintenance company. This company oversees not just maintenance but also all of the other jobs that are needed to keep the structure open. It then gives the majority of the profits from the tower back to the city. Today some 500 employees handle the tower's operations. They work in its restaurants, keep the machinery in order and make repairs to the structure, operate its elevators, provide security, direct crowds headed in and out, and more. Some employees belong to specialized crews, such as the group charged with repainting the tower every 7 years. Typically, a different color is chosen each time the tower is repainted, with a public vote taken to determine this choice. Not all of the tower's surfaces receive exactly the same shade of paint. However, when a new coat is added, different shades of a specific color are used, with the lightest at the top. This creates the illusion for people on the ground that the tower is taller. Another specialized crew is responsible for replacing, as needed, the approximately 20,000 light bulbs used to illuminate the tower at night. This array of bulbs produces a sparkling display every night, outlining the tower's shape once every hour from dusk until 1 a.m. Some 300 spotlights arrayed around the tower also dramatically light up the structure at night, and beacons atop the tower, visible from up to 50 miles away, sweep the area. On occasion, extra lighting is installed to create light shows and fireworks displays for special events. Over the years, the tower has undergone a variety of small modifications from its original state, as well as major renovations. Other changes made over the years have included restoring the original facades of the first floor, which had been covered over early in the 20th century. The method of lighting up the tower has also been improved. In particular, gas lamps that originally lit its outline at night have now been replaced by some 20,000 electric light bulbs. More substantial changes include updates of the elevator systems. In 1965, a sharply increasing number of visitors prompted the use of new procedures and equipment for the elevators in all 4 legs. In the years since, the systems have been further upgraded with computer-controlled procedures. The original elevators had been run by operators who sat in precarious cages below the machines. Today, visitors can see the position of one of these operators, replaced by a mannequin. The original elevators were gradually scrapped, the last of them in 1982 after nearly a century of service. All of the cars in use are relatively standard. The current elevators are capable of carrying more than 100 people per trip and making a dozen round trips every hour. Workers have also installed emergency staircases, adding to the originals. Other modifications include the use of petroleum products to grease the elevator's mechanisms, replacing the original material, ox or pig fat mixed with hemp. In large part, the renovations were needed because of the sharp increase in the number of visitors. According to the maintenance company, in 2011, more people ascended the tower since the renovation of 1986 to 1987 than did so in the entire first century of its existence. By 2011, it was increasingly clear that the tower's public spaces were too cramped and inefficiently organized to accommodate these ever-increasing crowds. The planned restoration included major makeovers of the first level. For example, the maintenance company planned to rebuild the reception and conference rooms to make them more attractive as event spaces. Plans also called for updating restrooms, shops, restaurants, and other visitor services to make them more attractive, better able to accommodate large crowds, and easier to maintain. Possibly the biggest change was the addition of a huge glass floor in part of the first level's public space to allow visitors to see the city directly below. This glass floor was to cover about 5,500 square feet. Smaller renovations included a new look for the restaurants and improved shelters from the weather for those who are waiting for elevators. And the maintenance company planned to create new exhibits for the museum, improve the educational program, and expand other features of the tower's displays. Still another planned addition included a giant mural of 200 unpublished historical photos of the tower, for display on the ground floor near the ticket booths. In addition to updating the look and operation of the tower, the renovation project was to add a number of environmentally friendly new features. These included improved energy efficiency by converting to solar and wind energy for partially heating and lighting the tower. Other improvements were to make the tower more readily accessible to people with disabilities. Renovations and everything else about the tower could not have happened if the original plan to scrap the tower had come to pass. There were several reasons why this plan was abandoned. One arose simply out of sentimentality and affection. As the end of the contract between Eiffel and Parisian authorities drew near, huge numbers of people had come to love the tower and understand its importance. A massive protest would surely have erupted if the original plan had been carried out. And so in 1906 the city officially approved 5 more years of life for the tower, a condition that was in time made permanent. Not everyone was enthusiastic about the decision to keep the tower. Among the critics were some Parisian government authorities who considered the structure, if nothing else, simply too expensive to maintain. They were at best lukewarm at the prospect of keeping the tower and indicated that they would have preferred that it had not been built in the first place. Overall, the attitude among these authorities was one of tired acceptance. The prospect of dismantling the tower after 20 years was not the only threat it has faced. The structure was nearly destroyed during World War II. In 1940, the German Nazi army invaded and occupied Paris. The leader of the Nazis, Adolf Hitler, recognized that the tower was a powerful symbol of France's independence. He ordered it torn down, in part as a way to demoralize the nation and to assert his control over Paris. According to a 1941 article in the Australian newspaper Argus, Hitler had other reasons to dismantle the tower. He wanted to demolish the structure because it had no artistic or historic value. His idea was to use the iron as scrap material for the German war effort, which was in great need of the metal to build weapons. Obviously, this never happened. The exact reason is not clear. One likely explanation is that the Germans lacked the equipment they needed to dismantle the tower. However, there are also indications that the Nazi military governor in Paris never carried out Hitler's orders because he did not want to be known afterward as the man who destroyed the Eiffel Tower. In any case, the structure became a symbolic battleground. Hitler was photographed in front of it as a show of power, but otherwise the Germans were largely thwarted in their plans. French resistance fighters cut the cables for the elevators, so that the Nazis would be hampered in reaching the top. German soldiers were able to climb it, and they briefly exchanged the French flag with one displaying the swastika symbol of the Nazis. When Paris was liberated near the end of the war, the French flag once again flew proudly from the top of the tower. Nonetheless, to this day Eiffel remains intimately connected in the public eye with his tower. The engineer himself once said, only half jokingly, "I ought to be jealous of the tower. It is much more famous than I am. People seem to think it is my only work, whereas I have done other things after all." Eiffel died on December 27, 1923, at the age of 91 from a pneumonia. But he lives on in the form of the structure that bears his name, one of the great structures of the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe on channel. See you in the next video.